Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on Strong Foundations in the First Year of School. I'm Sue Morris-King, HMI. I'm Deputy Director for Schools and Early Education, and I'm joined this afternoon by my two senior colleagues, Kirsty Godfrey and Tim Jenner, both Senior HMI in the Schools and Early Education Policy team. So I'm going to talk you through the first part of our webinar, and then I'll hand over to Kirsty, and then I'll hand over to Tim as well. And we're just going to go off camera while we talk you through this webinar this afternoon. So let me talk you through the aims of the session. What we're going to do with you in this webinar this afternoon is to share some of the key messages from our recent publication, Strong Foundations in the First Years of School. We'll take a brief look at what the research says about giving children the best start to their education and the greatest chance of future educational success. And then we'll go on to explore with you the things that our research and our inspection findings suggest schools might want to pay particular attention to in reception and in Key Stage 1, so that all children soon become equipped with the knowledge and skills that will give them the foundations to access a broad curriculum in Key Stage 2 and, of course, beyond. We'll share some examples this afternoon of ways that schools have been effective in enabling all children, and especially those with the lowest starting points, to learn what they really need to by the end of Key Stage 1. So first of all, we'll take a look at the research about a high quality education. Ofsted's undertaken significant research in line with our strategic priority of giving children the best start in life. Previous research about what strong practice looks like in a reception class was encapsulated in our Bold Beginnings research, which you might well have read before. Our Best Start in Life research considers what works well for children from birth to 4 years old. We published part 3, which focuses on the specific areas of learning, in October 2024. And then finally, our research in reception and Key Stage 1, Strong Foundations in the First Years of School, has also been released in October. We've used our findings from this recent research to inform what we're going to talk to you about in this session. The Strong Foundations report draws on evidence from many of our previous publications, including those that you can see now on the slide, but also our curriculum research reviews and our subject reports. The evidence was also supplemented by visits to 20 schools to examine the specific implications for reception and for Key Stage 1. Now, a wide range of research is clear that high quality early education establishes the foundations for later success, including academic achievement, good health and well-being. Not only does high quality early education benefit all children, but it's especially beneficial for those whose early learning has been limited. Ofsted's subject reports show some notable improvements in primary schools over recent years. The teaching of reading has improved markedly. Our mathematics report in 2023 found a resounding positive shift in mathematics education in primary schools. However, the positives aren't always as evident for disadvantaged pupils. Around 3 in 10 disadvantaged pupils cannot decode sufficiently well by the end of Year 1. Our mathematics report noted the large gap between the lowest and highest achievers and between disadvantaged and advantaged pupils. We know that if these gaps are not closed in the early years, then they tend to widen later on. And we also know that once pupils fall behind, it is hard for them to catch up. Let's think then about the context in which schools are working and some of the implications of what we know about pupils' achievement. We know that schools continue to face significant challenges in dealing with the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on children currently in reception and in Key Stage 1. Children in the current reception cohort were born during the year the pandemic struck. And that really matters when we consider that what children learn when they're young has a profound and a lasting impact. Schools are reporting increased cases of developmental delay and lower levels of language on entry to school. By the end of Key Stage 1, all children need foundational knowledge, how to communicate, how to read, write and calculate. This includes the general knowledge that will help them to understand the world around them. Their physical, emotional and social development are also really important. Finally, developing executive function is crucial for both learning and well-being. And this means that children need to be able to focus their attention on what matters and screen out what is not relevant. They need to be able to hold information in their minds in order to work on it. And they need to be able to focus on a goal and work out when it is necessary to change their approach to achieve that goal. But we know that over time, data for the end of Key Stage 1 and the phonics screening check shows that some children, and often the most vulnerable, do not learn what they most urgently need as soon as they should. We also know one of the greatest challenges for teachers is when children have different starting points and progress at different rates. While providing different amounts of teaching and practice for children is a priority, it is a challenge for schools. And one of the reasons some children don't secure important foundational knowledge by the end of Key Stage 1. Our evidence suggests that the children who are already the most knowledgeable and confident when joining a school get the most out of reception in Key Stage 1. And those who need the most help to secure firm learning foundations do not always get the teaching and practice they need. As a result, even at this young age, some children fall further behind their peers. And once children fall behind, it is hard for them to catch up. So in the next part of our session, we'll look at the aims of the Strong Foundations report, and I'll talk you through the 3 main findings. Given the importance of making sure that all children have the best start in life, ensuring that children secure critical foundational knowledge by the end of Key Stage 1 is vital. So we were particularly interested to find out why some children struggle to learn the knowledge that their peers secure much more quickly. What could we learn from the most effective practice that would help all children learn what they need? This is what we want to highlight today and share in more detail in the Strong Foundations report. As our Chief Inspector, Sir Martin Oliver, has said, if we get it right for the most vulnerable pupils, we get it right for everyone. Our evidence suggests that pupils who begin school with the lowest starting points and those who start to fall behind are the most vulnerable to being affected by weaknesses in their early education. In the report, and in this webinar today, it is these pupils who will be at the forefront of our minds. We hope that through the report and in the webinar, we can shed some light on the practices we see which are likely to be the most helpful or unhelpful, with the aim of supporting schools in placing their attention where it is likely to have the most positive impact. Rather than review the whole curriculum for reception and Key Stage 1, which our previous research reviews and subject reports have already covered, this report set out to identify the aspects of the reception and Key Stage 1 curriculum that evidence suggests would be particularly helpful for schools to focus on. These related to the common weaknesses found in schools and where there are misunderstandings about national curriculum expectations. Throughout, the intention is to focus on the children who really need the most effective early education, those with the lowest starting points, or those who start to fall behind. And by identifying the most helpful and unhelpful practice, our intention is to direct schools' attention to spending time on what makes the biggest difference and to avoid some of the activities that might fill the timetable but can waste valuable learning time. And finally, we point out examples such as in phonics and mathematics, where greater rigour to curriculum thinking in recent years can be useful when thinking about less well-developed aspects of the reception and Key Stage 1 curriculum. So our research identified 3 main findings. Here is the first, and that is that some schools are not making sure that all children learn the foundational knowledge that they will need later. And this, of course, makes it harder for children to learn at Key Stage 2. In the strongest examples, schools not only showed a determination that all children would gain the knowledge that they needed, but they've made that possible by clearly identifying what children needed to know each step of the way and checking that children had learned and remembered it. However, some schools were not as explicit in identifying the important knowledge that all pupils needed. And this meant that teachers did not know what to prioritise in their teaching and assessment. When securing important knowledge was left too much to chance, not enough children were well prepared to access the curriculum at Key Stage 2. Some curriculums were overloaded with activities that didn't help children to build fluency in foundational knowledge and skills. This left too little time for children to practice what they'd been taught until they could remember it automatically. Most schools are clear that certain learning, such as learning to read and write and understand and use numbers, cannot be left to chance through a child's own choices. However, when the reception curriculum is not clear enough about what all children need to learn, it can become merely a list of activities. Simply providing experiences that children can choose from is not enough. When there is a choice about whether to take part, some children, and often those who needed the most teaching and practice, are able to opt out and therefore not learn what they need, and this exacerbates their disadvantage. Our second main finding was that children who begin school with the lowest starting points and those who start to fall behind are the most affected by weaknesses in curriculum, teaching and assessment. This vulnerable minority of children are more likely to suffer when opportunities to learn are not equitable. Adults tend not to interact with them as much as they do with other children, and this hinders important language development. These children are likely to need more teaching and practice opportunities than their peers. Some classroom organisation, for example, expecting children who are already behind to attempt tasks that are well beyond their competence, results in them wasting time and struggling or being overly supported and told the answers, rather than using that time to teach them the knowledge they need to be successful and to learn what their peers already know. For example, children in the reception year are often asked to write stories or write about recent events before they have learned the necessary knowledge and skills. This is particularly difficult for children with lower starting points. For example, all the children in a Year 1 class might be expected to write a character description, even though some of them still cannot form all their letters or have the phonics knowledge to spell the words. As a result, the gap between them and their peers widens. And our third main finding is that schools' curriculums for English and literacy in the early years, beyond the teaching of phonics, are often weak. We know that the teaching of reading is improving. Government policies and guidance and our research on how well schools teach children to read have highlighted the role of systematic synthetic phonics. Practice had improved. Staff have received high quality training and children get plenty of chances to rehearse and embed what they're learning. Other areas of the English or literacy curriculum, such as spoken language, though, and transcription, lack this rigour. Schools sometimes introduce complex reading and writing tasks too early, and they don't give children enough teaching and practice for them to become fluent in foundational knowledge and skills, such as in handwriting and in composing simple sentences. And as we've heard in the previous finding, this particularly affects lower attaining children. We saw that at the end of Key Stage 1 assessments can unhelpfully influence schools' decisions about the English curriculum. These assessments are no longer statutory. However, many schools still provide children with complex reading and writing tasks that replicate those tests well before they've taught them what they need to know to complete them successfully. I'm now going to hand over to Kirsty to take us through the next part of the webinar.
Thank you, Sue. So as we've heard, foundational knowledge is crucial for later learning. So in this part of the session, we'll share some research along with examples of effective and less effective practice. In doing so, we hope this will help you to focus on what our evidence suggests will make the biggest difference in enabling all children, and especially those with the lowest starting points or those who start to fall behind, to learn what they need by the end of Key Stage 1. So what do we mean by foundational knowledge and skills? Here are some examples of foundational knowledge that underpin children's later ability to learn. As we heard from Sue, by the end of Key Stage 1, all children need this foundational knowledge, such as how to communicate, read, write and calculate, including the general knowledge that will help them to understand the world around them. Physical, emotional and social development are also important, as is executive function. The School Inspection Handbook reminds us in paragraph 234 that in Key Stage 1, pupils should be able to read, write and use mathematical knowledge, ideas and operations so that they're able to access a broad and balanced curriculum at Key Stage 2. This is something that is a critical part of both graded and ungraded inspections. In today's session, we'll focus in particular on communication and language, early reading and early writing, as it's in these areas especially that our evidence suggests there are improvements that could help all children learn what they need as soon as they should. However, some of the principles we'll share later in the session cut across different examples of foundational knowledge. To start with, let's hear the story of Jo to find out what happens when pupils don't secure important foundational knowledge and skills. So I'm going to tell you the story of Jo. As you learn about her journey, think about what could have worked better for Jo at each point of her education. When Jo is 3, she goes to the nursery at school for 2 sessions per week. She doesn't seem to say much as the other children. Adults say that in the limited time that they have with her, their priority is socialisation, so they're happy to just let her play. Jo chooses to play with only some of the activities on offer. She plays in the sandpit, in the home corner, and with the train track. She flits between areas and usually plays alone. Jo can't express her wants and needs very well, but she doesn't disrupt anyone else, so no one really notices. When Jo gets to 5 and she's now learning phonics, she knows the routines well and always sits in the right place. When her teacher asks the children to say the sound for the grapheme shown, Jo answers, but just a few seconds after everyone else. She knows what to say because she copies the other children. Jo finds lower Key Stage 2 hard. Her teacher blames the Year 3 gap. She didn't meet the expected standard in reading or mathematics at the end of Key Stage 1, so a teaching assistant keeps an eye on her and writes down all of the words which Jo can't spell. They read the worksheets to her and also make sure that she can complete the maths work. Jo is happy as long as the TA is there to tell her what to do. Let's think of Jo when she's 11 and about to leave primary school. She's really worried about going to secondary school because she won't be with her friend Kim, who always helps her with the answers to questions. Jo likes the class routines because she can always phone a friend if she's asked anything. Her teacher says that she has special needs and she gets extra help. This means that someone reads the sheet to her and gets her to put the right answers in the right place. Jo doesn't think that she could manage to do that by herself. Jo's attendance declines when she starts secondary school. She often feels unwell on a Thursday afternoon when she has PE and English with the teacher that she doesn't like. After lunch, it's always drop everything and read time. Jo has been reading the same graphic novel for months now. She's usually just flicking through it to make sure her teacher thinks that she's reading it. In Year 11, Jo doesn't get into much trouble at school because she doesn't turn up very often. She says that this is because she's anxious. When she does go to school, she spends a lot of time in the hub, lying on the beanbags. The SENCO is trying to set up equine therapy to help her become more confident. Jo doesn't get any GCSEs. She finds it hard to get a job because she can't read very well, but doesn't want to tell anyone this. So have a think what could have worked better for Jo. Here are some of the things that could have worked better for Jo through her education. All of Jo's experiences could have been avoided if the school had been effective in getting that early education right. Jo needed more chances to develop communication and language in the nursery. The school could have made sure that they were proactive about making sure all children received high quality interactions with adults. In phonics lessons, teachers could have checked her knowledge of sounds directly and possibly spent more time to remind her of these before the next lesson. This would have helped her increase her fluency and build her confidence. In Key Stage 2, a teaching assistant providing all the answers didn't help her to secure the knowledge that she needed. More opportunities to read at Key Stage 3 wouldn't help her to practice decoding. She needed specific teaching to secure this knowledge. By the end of her secondary career, Jo was unhappy and a poor attender. The underlying roots of this are in the fact that she simply didn't learn the right things at the right time, so the classroom isn't a positive place to be. We can really see here that it gets harder to address these gaps as pupils get older. Now let's take a look at some of the foundational knowledge which is vital for children to learn and that will provide the high quality early education that Jo missed out on. First of all, communication and language. The rate at which children develop their language depends on the quality and quantity of interactions with adults. We know that children enter schools with significantly different starting points. Some will have listened to many stories repeatedly and have had lots of rich conversations with adults. These children are not more intelligent than other children. They've just benefited from some advantages that other children have not had. Where schools make the biggest difference for those children without the same vocabulary, they find out who these children are, and then they give those children as many opportunities as possible to develop their spoken language. One of the significant findings in our Strong Foundations report was that adults spoke more frequently to the chatty children who dominated conversations, and those who really needed adult interactions to develop their language didn't always get them. Research is clear that frequent, high-quality interactions between children and adults play a fundamental role in building the knowledge and skills that children will need. And these are more likely to take place when, firstly, adults notice what children know and can do and respond accordingly. That's because their responses are based on what they know about each child and their wider understanding of child development. Secondly, when adults know the curriculum in advance. Interactions can be more effective when staff know what they want their children to learn because they can intentionally introduce new words, the vocabulary that will help children describe their thoughts and feelings and understand the world around them. And finally, all children experience enough planned and incidental interactions with adults to learn what they need, accepting, of course, that some children will need more targeted time and attention than others. We also know that stories, rhymes, and songs are another important way that children can gain an understanding of language. They help to give children the language knowledge they need to understand what they read, once they can read accurately and speedily for themselves, and to be able to compose a piece of writing, once they're able to accurately form letters and spell words using their phonic knowledge. Children will come across a more broad and rich vocabulary in books than they hear in everyday conversation, and there should be lots of repetition in the early stages. Interestingly, our recent Best Start in Life Part 3 research shows that shared reading, where an adult reads and discusses a book with a small group of children, is especially beneficial for children with lower levels of language. We know that reading is important foundational knowledge. Reading is the gateway to learning across the curriculum. And as we heard in one of the main findings, the teaching of reading has markedly improved in primary schools over the last few years. But there is still more to do, and particularly for the lowest attaining children, many of whom may also be disadvantaged or have special educational needs. Many of you will be familiar with Goff and Tunmer's simple view of reading, but let's just remind ourselves of what the diagram tells us. Shortly, we'll use this to see the parallels with writing. The model shows that there are two elements to being able to read: word reading and language comprehension. Pupils need to develop both language comprehension and word reading if they're able to read with comprehension and get to that top right quadrant. So reading with comprehension is the product of both. Neither is sufficient on its own. In the most effective schools, we see each element taught separately in the earliest stages. So the word reading accuracy, that's taught through phonics, whereas the language comprehension is gained through those frequent high quality interactions, being read to and discussing a wide range of books, and also the language knowledge that's gained from studying a broad curriculum. But in some schools, there is a rush to have a whole school approach to reading comprehension. And this approach often replicates those end of key stage assessments for Year 6 and the now non-statutory Year 2 tests. This might not always be appropriate for the pupils whose word reading knowledge is not developed well enough for them to benefit from this. So let's have a think about an example. A school has recently introduced a whole school approach to teaching reading comprehension. It starts at Year 1. In Year 1 today, each group in the class have the same book about hedgehogs. The teacher's working with the yellow group. The children in this group can't read the book, so the teacher reads it for them. They then have to answer the questions on the worksheet and record them in their book. The children can't read the questions, so the teacher reads the worksheet to them and asks them if they can remember what the text said to help them answer the questions. If the children can't remember the answers, the teacher tells them again or writes it down for them to copy in their books. The children not only find it difficult to remember the answers to the questions, but they also struggle to form some of the letters and spell many of the words that they're trying to write. But school leaders believe that this is really inclusive practice because this group are accessing age-appropriate texts, just like their peers. Our evidence shows that this sort of experience for the lowest attaining children in Key Stage 1 is not unusual. Pupils are being asked to complete a complex task before they've secured the knowledge they need to be able to do this. And that wastes valuable time that could be better spent teaching and/or practicing word reading fluency and learn what their peers already know. Expecting children to answer written comprehension questions when they can neither read the text on their own nor write down their answers is not realistic. They need more practice in reading decodable books to develop their reading fluency. And they also need time to develop their language comprehension by talking with adults about rich and interesting texts. As the national curriculum says, for pupils who do not have the phonic knowledge and skills they need, teachers should use the previous year group's programmes of study for word reading and spelling so that pupils' word reading skills catch up. However, teachers should use the age-appropriate programme of study for comprehension so that these pupils hear and talk about poems, books, rhymes, and other writing and vocabulary with the rest of the class. Moving on to transcription now, that is spelling and handwriting. Transcription is also important foundational knowledge that pupils need to become fluent with. Our understanding of word reading fluency helps us here. Just as with reading, careful consideration needs to be given to when and how children acquire these important skills. And if they're not secured as intended, schools will need to consider providing enough additional teaching and practice to make sure children catch up quickly. Pupils will not reliably discover accurate letter formation or spelling. It needs to be directly taught. And then pupils need to practice what they've been taught. But our findings show that few schools give pupils sufficient chance to practice this knowledge. Using the simple view of reading, but applying it to writing here, helps us see the similarities between reading and writing. The axes in this case reflect both the National Curriculum for Writing and the EYFS Educational Programme for Literacy. And you'll see there composition and transcription. What we can see from the most successful schools is that just like with reading, these two elements benefit from teaching separately in the earliest stages. Fluency in transcription frees up the working memory to be able to focus on composing a piece of writing. But before pupils can put their ideas in a written form, they need to have those ideas, the words, and they need to be able to say what they want to write, either aloud or silently. And that's oral composition, which relies on pupils' language comprehension. Once pupils do have the necessary transcriptional knowledge and skills, using their phonics knowledge for spelling and knowing how to form their letters accurately, they can much more easily focus on communicating their ideas in a written form. And that's that top right quadrant. So just as fluent word reading is essential to reading with comprehension, the same goes for transcription fluency with children's writing composition. Our English report and Strong Foundations report found that the most successful schools give children plenty of teaching and practice to gain high degrees of fluency with transcription. In contrast, when children struggled to gain transcription fluency, we found that the lowest attaining children in a class were expected to carry out independent writing tasks well before they had the required knowledge and skills. When children are asked to write lots of words that they don't know how to spell or don't know how to form the letters accurately, it's just like giving them a book with lots of words in that they can't read. They have to resort to guessing, and they waste some time by doing that, rather than practicing the knowledge that they would need to allow them to write fluently. These sorts of practices may confuse children, make it more difficult than necessary for them to learn, or even discourage them. The national curriculum, as we can see here, for years 1 to 4, includes reference to dictation. Writing simple dictated sentences that include words taught so far gives children opportunities to practice and apply their spelling without their having to think about what it is that they want to say. Children's writing generally develops at a slower pace than their reading. Before they can write independently in a way that can be read by others, they need to know what they want to say, how to identify sounds in words, at least one way to spell each of the sounds of English, and how to form letters. In the most effective schools visited as part of our research, when transcription fluency was the teaching aim, we saw pupils practicing what they'd been taught with spelling and letter formation through dictation. So we can think of dictation as the writing equivalent of decodable books. Just as decodable books isolate the knowledge that's been taught, allowing it to be practiced, in the same way, dictation is a way to make sure that children can accurately spell every word and form every letter, as they've already been taught the knowledge needed. If children have not developed sufficient fluency in transcription, it will be hard for them to compose a piece of writing independently. Not all children will have the spelling and handwriting skills they need to write down everything that they could compose out loud. So activities should set children up for success. However, it is common practice in some schools, including for children as young as reception, to be asked to compose writing before they have that transcription knowledge to be successful. But of course, with plenty of practice in writing from dictation, children will find it easier to do that independent writing. And just like with reading, some whole school approaches to writing might not be realistic for children in the earliest stages of learning to write. So, for example, in some schools, the writing curriculum is based on producing different text types, like instructions, recounts, and stories. When schools place their focus on text types in reception and Key Stage 1, there can be a tendency to pay less attention to foundational knowledge such as spelling, handwriting, and orally composing sentences, which of course is the knowledge that would allow them to compose such pieces of extended writing successfully. So let's have a look at an example of how dictation might be used. If we imagine the reception teacher wants the children to write a shopping list, rather than asking the children to think of the items themselves, the teacher could make that decision and dictate the words, matching them to children's current transcription knowledge and skills. So given the stage of the year we're at now, close to the October half term, then children are likely to be able to write the word ham. But at this point, they probably won't have the phonic knowledge to spell words like chips or grapes, which contain consonant and vowel digraphs that won't have been taught yet. So dictation helps the teacher to be able to tailor the transcription practice to what different groups within that one class know. And of course, if ham is the only shopping list item the teacher can think of that children will know how to spell, then writing a shopping list might not be the most useful activity if the purpose is developing children's transcription fluency. However, if the purpose is more around naming those food items and language knowledge is therefore the main focus, then perhaps the activity could be done orally instead, with the adult perhaps modelling writing that shopping list. And that could be really helpful in encouraging children to choose to write as they play. The most successful schools taught the two distinct parts of writing, oral composition and transcription, separately in the early stages. And that dictation practice continued until pupils were fluent, whatever their age. This made sure that pupils gained the knowledge they needed to complete complex extended writing tasks, like writing a story or a recount. With plenty of practice in writing from dictation, children find it easier to write independently. And at this point, you might be wondering, well, what does it mean for those children that choose to write something independently? And direct instruction of transcription and oral composition certainly doesn't stop those children who can already write from choosing to do so independently, or curb the enthusiasm of those children who choose to mark make as they play. But what is important is getting all children off the starting blocks so that they have the knowledge needed to be successful with writing. And so it's really just important to make the best use of the time when they're with an adult to do that. Of course, this message, though, about teaching the different parts of writing separately in the early stages also has implications for other subjects where children are asked to write. Writing in books in science or history or any other subject should consider children's transcription knowledge, and carefully dictated words or sentences matched to children's transcription knowledge might be helpful for some children if they don't have the knowledge needed to write independently. And now I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to take you through the next part of the session.
Thank you, Kirsty. In this final part of the session, we're going to just briefly summarise some of the findings from the report and also provide some hopefully helpful suggestions and practical tips. In order to do this, we've identified 4 really key themes that pull together our findings from the report. And although we focus mainly on English today, these principles can be applied across the curriculum. The first of these is the importance of a curriculum which sets out clearly the small steps which children need to learn at each stage, and ensuring that children are given enough teaching and practice to become fluent in these. These are the fundamentals which explain the strengths that we've typically seen in early reading. However, as we've noted, this often was weaker in English and literacy curriculums beyond phonics. Often, curriculums tended to introduce complex reading and writing tasks too early, and there wasn't enough emphasis on teaching and practicing some foundational knowledge, such as how to compose simple sentences orally, how to hold a pencil correctly and accurately form letters and numbers, and how to spell. In some of the schools we visited, we saw a lack of awareness of the national curriculum requirements for handwriting in Key Stage 1. For example, some schools only taught handwriting in phonics lessons, which meant that elements of the handwriting programs of study, such as number formation and teaching letter formation through families of letters which are formed in similar ways, were not part of the curriculum in those schools. In the most effective schools, enough time was given to providing the teaching and practice needed to make sure that all children learned important knowledge to fluency. These schools accepted that some children would need more practice than others and prioritised this when deciding how to organise their teaching. They knew that rushing through the curriculum and expecting children to do too much too soon might give the illusion of progress, but actually creates gaps in children's knowledge that it will take more time to deal with later. And thinking about practice, it might be helpful to keep in mind the phrase practice makes permanent. While we might be more familiar with the phrase practice makes perfect, We know that if children are practicing something incorrectly or with serious gaps or misconceptions, then they can embed errors, and that this can result in habits that are more difficult to break at a later stage. And we sometimes see the impact of this with children even in Key Stage 2 who still have an unhelpful pen grip or an incorrect letter formation, for example. Now, an example to illustrate these points about developing a curriculum with small steps and enough teaching and practice to make sure that all children develop these to fluency. If, let's say, a teacher wants children to be able to retell a story by the end of the week, then it's really important to identify what small steps will need to be taught, checked, and practiced along the way to help every child reach that endpoint. If this task isn't broken down into smaller steps, it can be left to chance whether a child succeeds or not. Once the small steps of knowledge are clear, it's important to provide the right amount of teaching and practice for them to become secure for all children. Some children might need more teaching and practice than others. For example, if a group of children are struggling to name all of the characters in a story that they're going to be retelling by the end of the week, then it should tell the teacher they need more time still to become more familiar with the story. They might need adults to read it to them a few more times in a smaller group. And they would need more regular checks on whether they can indeed name the characters and, for example, describe the beginning, middle, and end of the story to check that they are building up the knowledge that they need to be able to successfully complete the ultimate task. Our second key principle is that language is absolutely key. Our report underlines the value of stories, rhymes, and songs, including repeating and revisiting these, and the strengths we saw in many schools in making use of these. But we also found that opportunities to develop spoken language were not always maximised. In order to write, as Kirsty has told us, children need to be able to prepare their ideas and to be able to compose orally, that is to say out loud what they want to write. In some schools, there was a rush to have work recorded in books, and those schools often missed out opportunities for discussions, for pupils to compose sentences orally, for them to retell stories and to recite poems and learn them off by heart for performance. A really important reminder for us that not everything needs to be recorded in books for it to be valuable. We know that in some schools there are expectations about the amount of written recording in books. However, Ofsted does not have any set requirement for this. Reading is really valuable in its own right, as is discussing what has been read. There doesn't need to be written proof that this has happened. Whole school policies about the frequency of work in books can be unrealistic for reception and Key Stage 1 classes, where spoken language needs to be prioritised, and not all children have the knowledge they need to record their learning in writing. The development of spoken language rests heavily on the quality and frequency of interaction with adults, not necessarily on the work that is in children's books. Our third key principle was the crucial importance of focusing on those who need the most support. Sometimes we saw adults giving more attention to the more confident and articulate children in a group. This promotes those children's intellectual and social development, but at the expense of the minority who need the most support. It's crucial that we pay particular attention to those who are at most risk of falling behind. The curriculum is also important here. In reception classrooms in particular, the most effective curriculums were really clear about what all children should know, so it wasn't possible for some children to opt out of crucial learning. In these schools, staff knew that simply providing experiences that children can choose from isn't enough. Not all children take part fully in what is offered, and those with more limited knowledge are often the least likely to participate, which can widen gaps over time. And as we've discussed, some children will need more teaching or practice, and some may even need to be taught from an earlier stage in the curriculum. With fluency, whether that's with word reading, handwriting, spelling, or number facts, it's really helpful to think about going as fast as possible, but as slow as necessary. Children can't just leapfrog through the curriculum, moving to more complex tasks, which may well be age appropriate, in the hope that those who are struggling will just work it out and catch up. Some children in a class will need teaching from an earlier stage of the same curriculum. They need to learn the knowledge that their peers already have. We know that research says that there are times when differentiation can be unhelpful, but when the focus is on building fluency in essential foundational knowledge, it is absolutely necessary. And this can sometimes challenge people's thinking about inclusion. Our subject reports and Strong Foundations report found lots of schools taking approaches which they felt were inclusive, but actually failed to address what some pupils most urgently needed to learn. For example, classroom practice, such as adults overly supporting children through an activity, perhaps by telling them the answers or giving them sentences to copy, wastes valuable learning time. It means that the task is too complex, and that time would be better spent on teaching or practicing the knowledge that would allow them to be successful with such a task. The best way to make sure that pupils are and feel included in the classroom is to give them the knowledge that their peers already have, and which will give them the best chance of learning the curriculum over time, not just completing a particular task in the moment. The national curriculum provides some helpful reminders about this message. The Key Stage 1 national curriculum for maths, for example, says that while the expectation is that the majority of pupils will move through the programs of study at broadly the same pace, decisions about when to progress should always be based on the security of pupils' understanding and their readiness to progress to the next stage. It goes on to say really clearly that those who are not sufficiently fluent with earlier material should consolidate their understanding, including through additional practice, before moving on. The National Curriculum for English has a similar message. It says that for pupils who do not have the phonic knowledge and skills they need, teachers should use the programs of study from earlier year groups for word reading and spelling to help them catch up. However, as Kirsty has outlined, these pupils should hear and talk about the same texts as the rest of their class. And related to this, our fourth principle is that some children are at different stages of the same curriculum. I just want to explore the differentiation issue a little bit further. Because all children need fluency with foundational knowledge and skills to make progress later, this means that some of them, including some children with special educational needs or disabilities, may need to work at an earlier stage of the curriculum than their peers. This will enable them to learn and practice important knowledge that their peers already have until it is fluent. We often see children with insufficient knowledge being expected to attempt the same learning as their peers. Struggling to access the lesson wastes precious time and can threaten children's self-confidence. Children who need more teaching and practice opportunities than their peers can end up with less. Schools may have children of different ages who are at the same stage of the curriculum journey with their fluency in word reading or transcription or number facts. For example, Joel on the left, who is 5, is at an early stage of learning to write, and Anya, who is 7 on the right, may be at that same stage. If neither of them know how to form letters correctly or spell simple words fluently, then this is what they need to learn. Neither should be given more complex tasks before they have mastered this early knowledge. But Anya does need to learn this knowledge more urgently and is likely to need additional teaching and practice to make this happen. Stage is therefore likely to be more important than age when knowing what to teach, when it comes to knowledge that builds step by step, like fluency in word reading, spelling, handwriting, and number facts. But we do also need to keep an awareness of age so that we know how urgent it is that that knowledge becomes fluent for children. Now, just to bring it together, first of all, we want to point you to the fact that our report also includes some questions that leaders might find really useful to consider when evaluating their own work to secure foundational knowledge and skills for every child. In the report, you will find a series of questions designed to be helpful for your own reflection or discussion with colleagues, which relate to curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, personal development, behaviour, and attitudes. And here we have some key messages that summarise everything that we've covered today. Firstly, a child's early education right from the start has a significant impact on their later life chances, and this is especially true for the most vulnerable children. Foundational knowledge needs to be taught, as children do not necessarily discover it. And lower attaining pupils may well need more explicit teaching and practice. Successful schools do not accept that some children will catch up later. They know that gaps tend to widen rather than close. Children should secure important foundational knowledge before moving on to more complex tasks. Securing this foundational knowledge will continue to be a priority at whatever age, given that it affects children's ability to access the full curriculum. And now we're going to come back to Sue, who's going to take some questions, I think.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Kirsty. And thanks everybody who's been listening this afternoon to the webinar, and I really hope that you found it helpful. Thanks also if you've sent questions in advance. What we've done with those is we've tried to weave them through as we've been planning the webinar, so I hope that lots of those have already been answered. I think we've got time for one question, and I'm going to pick out one about foundational knowledge on inspection. So the question is, how will inspectors look at foundational knowledge on inspection? And I think it might be useful if we divide this into graded inspections and then ungraded inspections. So Kirsty, do you want to pick up the graded question part of that?
Of course, yeah. So on a graded inspection in a school that's got primary age pupils, inspectors carry out a reading deep dive, and they do that to evaluate how well pupils are taught to read. We pay particular attention to those pupils that most need to improve the reading, to assess how well the school is teaching phonics to support children to become confident and fluent readers. We're also, of course, in a primary school very likely, I think, to do a mathematics deep dive. And actually, across all of the different deep dives that we might do in a primary school, we'll be interested in how well pupils are developing that foundational knowledge to enable them to access the full curriculum. And that links very much to that paragraph 234 that we shared earlier on in the webinar that's from our handbook.
Thanks, Kirsty. And people listening might well have picked up that on ungraded inspections now, we're doing things slightly differently, and we're using something called focus areas, and we're not using deep dives in those ungraded inspections. So Tim, do you want to talk us through how will we look at foundational knowledge on ungraded inspections?
Of course, yeah. So as you've said, we will consider the quality of education on ungraded inspections through focus areas, and those will look at groups of subjects. In primary schools, one of these focus areas will be centred on early English and mathematics. So it will give us that opportunity to look really carefully at those aspects of the school's work that we've talked about today. But on all ungraded inspections, with whatever age pupils, inspectors will focus on the extent to which all pupils, and particularly those pupils who are disadvantaged, including pupils with SEND, are able to read, write and use mathematical knowledge and ideas and operations to an age-appropriate level and fluency, so they're able to access a broad and balanced curriculum, which is that handbook part that Kirsty referred to earlier.
Thanks, Tim. So we're going to finish this afternoon's webinar there. Let me thank you once again for coming and listening. I do hope that you have found this useful in your work, and as I mentioned, please do, if you would like to, look for this on our YouTube channel and pass on the word to any other colleagues who you think might find it interesting. Thank you.